So it's a distinct honor to be able to introduce to you Professor Martin Kramer. I think he's well known internationally and locally. Martin Kramer is currently the president of the Shalem College. The Shalem College is a new undergraduate liberal arts college in Jerusalem, and it's really developing an international reputation for being an up-and-coming university. They take top-tier university students, so it's a place to watch develop. And I think it's the first liberal arts college in Israel, I believe, ever, yeah. So Martin Kramer is an expert or an authority on contemporary Islam and Arab politics. Martin earned his undergraduate and doctoral degrees of Near East Studies from Princeton University. During a 25-year academic career at Tel Aviv University, he directed the Moshe Dayan Center for Middle East and African Studies. Martin has taught as a visiting professor at Brandeis University, the University of Chicago, Cornell, Georgetown, and the Johns Hopkins University. He served as a visiting fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington. He was also a fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and at the Harvard University's Olin Institute for Strategic Studies. I'd recommend, he's published widely over the years, and I would recommend, for those of you who don't know, his blog is very important. It's called Sandbox. I'd urge you to read it. You can be kept up on not only analysis, but kind of the day-to-day developments in the region. Tonight, Martin Kramer is going to speak about, the title of his talk is called Gaza equals Auschwitz, Antisemitism by Analogy, question mark. So it's an honor that you're here. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles, for that very kind introduction. Thank you all for coming out on what is, for someone coming from Israel, a bitterly cold night. I don't know if I was in your position whether I would brave it. Charles did me a favor by inviting me to address this group. The usual course of a day for a college president can be, let us say, challenging, but sometimes tedious. You deal with the small details of university administration, college administration. We're a new college, so everything we do is precedent setting, which means that everything we do requires detailed discussions of principle. When intellectuals do that, as you can imagine, it can be tiresome. So what Charles asked me to do is basically pull myself out of my day-to-day concerns and think about a few other issues that are of concern to me, although initially I wasn't sure what I would discuss because I'm not a researcher of anti-Semitism. I've published the odd piece on Islamic varieties of anti-Semitism, but even that I haven't done for a very long time. But during this summer war between Hamas and Israel, I wrote a short piece with the same title as this presentation. If you go online, you'll find it. It's called Gaza equals Auschwitz. And there I documented a surge in this sort of analogy from a specific source. That was the faculty of Columbia University. Experts call this Holocaust inversion. Holocaust inversion is the claim that Israel acts towards the Palestinians as the Nazis acted toward the Jews. In that article, I called it Jew baiting. And I wrote this, and I quote myself here. Jew baiting covers a wider range than anti-Semitism, and Holocaust inversion is its favorite technique. In other words, I chose not to label it anti-Semitism, but to put it in another category. I called it Jew baiting, and I'll come to that in a moment. The practice of which might not necessarily be anti-Semitic. Now, after I published that piece, I began to wonder whether I'd been sufficiently rigorous in my classification of Holocaust inversion. And I'm still interested in the question of whether it does deserve to be read as anti-Semitism, and I will get back to that at the end of this talk. But on the way, I've asked another more compelling question, and it is this: just what purpose does Holocaust inversion serve? And here I'm not talking about crackpot websites or off in Karachi, but among people whom we assume to be sophisticated about history and politics. For once, we are in the realm of academics and leading institutions. I think it is highly unlikely that anyone actually believes that Israel conducts itself as Nazi Germany did. And that goes for intellectuals who make or allude to the analogy, as well as to their elite audiences. And yet, it continues to surface in a variety of forms. It's even gaining, one could argue, wider dissemination. So what is going on here? What actual function do these claims really fill? And what I want to do is share some of my tentative conclusions. And I say they are tentative. This is my first crack at this. And so any input that you can give me, which will assist me in seeing it perhaps from an angle that I missed, will be useful. And so I'll welcome your responses and questions and comments later. But before I get into this question of the function, thank you. Let me give you a brief, I'm going to say potted history of Holocaust inversion and its different forms. It's evolved in 3 stages. The first stage, it was invented by British sympathizers of the Arabs, even as the ashes still filled the crematoria. It was then picked up by the Soviet Union with particular fervor after 1967. And its latest and present iterations are on the left in the West, including the Academy, and in the Muslim world, and wherever they overlap. So let me illustrate with a few examples from each of these 3 phases. We are indebted to the historian Rory Miller, who's shown us that the analogy between Zionism and Nazism even predates the creation of the State of Israel. Amazingly, it was a staple of anti-Zionist rhetoric in Britain as early as the mid-1940s, that is, just by the late stages of the war, when Europe teemed with Jewish refugees and before even one Palestinian Arab had taken flight. The disseminators of this notion were some British Arabists and the so-called Arab Office. The Arab Office was a pro-Arab information or propaganda office which had been set up to make the Palestinian Arab case in London, which was, of course, then the center of decision-making on the British mandate over Palestine. Their champion was a man named Sir Edward Spears, and this is what he wrote in 1945. Remember, this is 3 years before the creation of the State of Israel, at the conclusion of the war. The quote, "Political Zionism as it is manifested in Palestine today preaches very much the same doctrines as Hitler. Zionist policy in Palestine has many features similar to Nazi philosophy. The politics of Herrenvolk, the Nazi idea of Lebensraum, is also very in evidence in the Zionist philosophy. The training of youth is very similar under both organizations that have designed this one and the Nazi one." End of quote. And there are many more instances which Professor Miller brings. Now, if this claim is worth mentioning at all, it's to demonstrate that the attempt to assimilate Zionism to Nazism began even as Europe teemed with Jewish refugees and victims, even as the collaborationist Mufti of Jerusalem was on the run from Berlin, even before the word Holocaust became current, that happened only later, and even before an Israeli army fired its first shot. The approach of anti-Zionists was to always associate Zionism with the most threatening and ominous evil of the day. Now, there's a paradox here. At the very moment that the British Arabists were warning that a Jewish state would behave in a Nazi manner, the American Arabists, people in the State Department, were warning that it would behave in a communist one because they thought, well, this Zionist movement is socialist and had affiliations with the Soviet Union and might turn into a Soviet bridgehead in the Middle East. So the most threatening and ominous evil looked very different from Washington. But one way or another, there's no evidence that either projection, Israel would behave in a Nazi way or a communist way, had any impact on policy in London or Washington. Now, the most famous case of a British supporter of the Arab cause propounding the equivalence of Nazism and Zionism was the big think historian Arnold Toynbee, who was a cult figure in the English-speaking world. Some of you are probably too young to have read him, But you go back and you'll find his picture on the cover of Time magazine way back in the 50s, when wise men from Europe were considered to be oracles. And Toynbee took his place with the publication of his famous study of history in many volumes. He was also known for his far-fetched analogies. Toynbee once called the contemporary Israeli, and I quote him, a Janus figure, part American farmer technician, part Nazi Sicarius. A Sicarius is an assassin. He also accused Israel of, quote, inflicting on an innocent, weaker neighbor, the Arabs, Palestinian Arabs, the very sufferings that the original victim, the Jews, had experienced at his stronger neighbor's hands, at the hands of the Nazis. Toynbee outdid even himself when he wrote this sentence in volume 8 of his study of history, and I quote him, and listen carefully. On the day of judgment, the gravest crime standing to the German National Socialists, the Nazis, to their account, might be not that they had exterminated a majority of the Western Jews, but that they had caused the surviving remnant of Jewry to stumble. Right, the stumble, of course, being Zionism and the creation of Israel, which is here cast as a more criminal venture even than the Nazi extermination itself. And needless to say, Toynbee did not go unanswered, and this caused quite a bit of back and forth at the time. But the really big boost to the equation of Zionism with Nazism came in the Soviet Union and began in the 1950s. It was Soviet propaganda that first began to equate the Star of David with the swastika in cartoons. It was in the Soviet Union that books were published alleging Zionist-Nazi collaboration. And after 1967, it was the Soviets who turned up the volume to high on the Zionist equals Nazi amplifier. Now, here are just a couple of the most noteworthy examples. The Soviet premier Alexei Kosygin at the United Nations in June 1967, that is, right on the heels of the Six-Day War. The Israeli occupation was days old. Quote, what is going on in areas occupied by the Israeli troops brings to mind the heinous crimes perpetrated by the fascists during World War II. In the same way as Hitler's Germany used to appoint Gauleiters to the occupied regions, the Israeli government is establishing an occupation administration on the seized territories and appointing its military governors there. And here is Party Secretary General Leonid Brezhnev the following month in Moscow. Quote, in the atrocities against the peaceful Arab populations, it seems the Israelis try to copy the crimes of the Nazi invaders. The aggressors conduct themselves like the worst bandits and commit atrocities in the Hitlerite style, end of quote. Now, it would be the Soviet example, I think, that the Arab propagandists would emulate, at first very hesitantly, because Nazism didn't have the same range of negative associations in the Arab world as Zionism had. But the more Arabs became aware of the Holocaust and the extent of Nazi crimes, the more eager they became to equate Zionism with Nazism. And this would spread still further into the Muslim world at large. And there are two examples of Nasser himself saying that the Zionist crimes exceeded those of the Nazis. Mahmoud Darwish, the Palestinian national poet, on one occasion said the same thing. And Yasser Arafat told his biographer, Alan Hart, that while, he said, I'm not one who usually resorts to the Nazi analogy, I must say that Israel is committing crimes which exceed those of the Nazis. So that's another topic, and there's actually a very good book by Webman and Litvak, which has a whole chapter devoted to the way in which this analogy is used in the Islamic world. And I'll just give maybe one example, which I find amusing because it stars Shimon Peres, no less, Nobel Prize winning peace, well, what can one say? Peace advocate and the architect of the Oslo Accords. On the eve of the Durban conference, he appeared on the cover of an Egyptian weekly in a Nazi uniform. He was foreign minister at the time. And when this drew criticism in Israel and elsewhere, a bevy of Egyptian intellectuals began to write to defend this analogy. And here's a quote from one of them. Peres committed and commits more ugly acts against the Arabs than the Nazis did against the Jews. That about Shimon Peres. And another wrote that Hitler, quote, Hitler is the one who is unjustly treated in the comparison with Peres. So that gives you the sense that really no one is immune to this kind of analogizing in the Arab Islamic world. Today, of course, the preeminent disseminator of Holocaust inversion in the Muslim world is the president of Turkey and the former premier of Turkey, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who returns to this theme repeatedly. Here is a prime example from this past summer, and I quote him, "What is the difference between Israeli actions and those of the Nazis and Hitler? How can you explain what the Israeli state has been doing in Gaza, Palestine, if not genocide? This is racism, this is fascism, this is keeping Hitler's spirit alive." End of quote. And there are many other quotes from Mr. Erdogan to that effect. Now, in the Western Academy, all of these threads have come together. The Arabist tradition, leftist agitprop, originally of Soviet inspiration, and Arab Muslim nationalism, creating hothouse conditions for the spread of Holocaust inversions into the writings and the classroom pronouncements of professors. And let me end this short example, this is a short history, with a couple of the examples that I had assembled for this article over the summer from members of the Columbia University faculty. The first is from Joseph Massad, professor of Arab Studies. Massad had earlier been accused by some students of Holocaust inversion in class. And in his defense, he had written the following, and I quote him, "The lie claiming that I would equate Israel with Nazi Germany is abhorrent. I have never made such a reprehensible equation," end of quote. So Massad was fully aware of the abhorrent and reprehensible nature of Holocaust inversion. But a few years later, after another Gaza flare-up, he published an article. This article was entitled, "The Gaza Ghetto Uprising." And not only was it entitled The Gaza Ghetto Uprising, but it was illustrated with that famous image of the surrendering child in the Warsaw Ghetto with his hands in the air. The article invoked an alleged Israeli plan to, quote, "make Israel a purely Jewish state that is Palästinierrein." And Massad characterized the Palestinian Authority, or rather what he called the Israeli-created Palestinian Collaborationist Authority, as the Judenrat, the Nazi equivalent. Now, this past summer, another Columbia professor, Hamid Dabashi, who's known for his somewhat inflammatory rhetoric, wrote this under the influence of the Hamas-Israel war, and I quote him, "After Gaza, not a single living Israeli can utter the word Auschwitz without it sounding like Gaza. Auschwitz, as a historical fact, is now archival. Auschwitz, as a metaphor, is now Palestinian. From now on, every time any Israeli, every time any Jew, anywhere in the world utters the word Auschwitz or the word Holocaust, the world will hear Gaza." End of quote. It's from that I take the title of my talk. I wonder what some of the survivors of Auschwitz would think about learning that, as a historical fact, their experience is now archival. Now notice how this kind of academic Holocaust inversion has evolved. It's a bit more elusive, it's a bit more elusive, and it's also theoretical. Go back to the original article and you'll see many references to Adorno. We are in the world of metaphors. Not only that, but in the academic Holocaust inversion, it's sometimes not the Holocaust or Nazi Germany that are evoked by name. There's a species of this that accuses Israel of genocide, or some variant of it, such as slow-motion genocide. You say, why slow-motion genocide? Genocide usually depletes a population, an assumption which is contradicted by the Palestinian case. Now, this would take us off in another direction. I've been in that direction before. I don't intend to go there now. But while genocide is obviously a comparative concept, which is not limited to the Holocaust, sometimes the context of the claim about genocide does refer directly to it and is a kind of Holocaust inversion. So in sum, the point of Holocaust inversion remains steady. Israel acts towards the Palestinians as the Nazis acted towards the Jews, albeit or perhaps on a different scale. And here it may be useful, just as an aside, to point to an offshoot on the Israeli left of this, which was inspired originally by the philosopher Yeshayahu Leibovich. Maybe some of you know that Leibovitz once called the Israeli judges who authorized what's called moderate physical force on Palestinian detainees, he called them Judeo-Nazis. And it caused quite a stir at the time. Yitzhak Rabin, who was prime minister, was informed that Leibovitz was going to be awarded the Israel Prize. He said, I would not attend the ceremony, and so Leibovitz says, I will not accept the prize. Over this phrase, you can call it the N-word, Israeli-style Nazi evocations. You might have also noticed it in a refined version just this past year when the author Amos Oz called illegal settlers, what they call the hilltop youths, Hebrew neo-Nazis. I say refined because neo-Nazis are not Nazis, and there's a distinction to be drawn there. It's also something that Nazis call themselves Nazis. People call neo-Nazis that. They don't necessarily call themselves that. Now we can add the former Shin Bet head, the late Avraham Shalom. If you saw the film The Gatekeepers, any of you see it? He made a statement there, and I quote him, "It's a brutal occupation force similar to the Germans in World War II, similar but not identical," end of quote. Avraham Shalom, who himself had been born in Vienna, I think, was a left activist in his later years and a major sponsor of the so-called Geneva Initiative. Some of this sounds like an echo of Toynbee, but Leibovitz or Oz or Shalom still come from within the Zionist frame of reference, and they warrant a different analysis. And by the way, any time that someone uses this in the Israeli framework, it usually ends badly for them. There's a strong reaction against it. It's done in a provocative way in order to capture a headline. But the pushback, in the case of Amos Oz, it was quite dramatic actually, usually suggests that it's a mistake to do it. And what happens, of course, though, is that when such statements are made, they are seized upon outside Israel as validating Holocaust inversion. Michael Oren, who had been Israeli ambassador to Washington, described the effect of what Shalom had said. I'll quote Michael. He said, "I appear on a campus, and a student gets up and says to me, 'You're speaking of your desire for peace, but your former FBI head is comparing you to a Nazi state. What are your comments on that?'" And I mean, it's obviously not the kind of question that an ambassador would expect to deal with, especially coming from someone who had been entrusted with the security of the State of Israel. Now, there's no doubt that Holocaust inversion today fulfills some of the same functions that it always did. It is a strategy to delegitimize Israel, while perhaps, depending on the context, simultaneously diminishing the Holocaust. The historian Deborah Lipstadt has said that about Holocaust inversion, that it, and I quote her, "elevates by a factor of a zillion any wrongdoings Israel might have done, and lessens by a factor of a zillion what the Germans did." But it must be admitted, too, that the fact that Israel invokes the Holocaust to justify its existence, sometimes to justify its actions and policies, creates also a powerful incentive among its enemies and critics, either to diminish the Holocaust, sometimes to deny the Holocaust, or, when that seems either impossible or immoral, to claim that Israel is replicating on some scale the Holocaust in its treatment of the Palestinians. The question I ask myself is this: does it actually work? On the face of it, Holocaust inversion is a trap. It is, even as Professor Joseph Massad once stated, so abhorrent and so reprehensible that its effect would seem to be to discredit whoever deploys it. And there are supporters of the Palestinian cause, especially Jewish supporters of the Palestinian cause, who from time to time urge that it not be used because it's so patently preposterous. I'll give you an example. Norman Finkelstein, right, whose project is to delink the Holocaust from Israel. He wrote a book called The Holocaust Industry, has been known to discourage Holocaust inversion. He said that once an Arab told him that even if the Holocaust did happen, a concession, right, even if the Holocaust did happen, what about the Palestinian Holocaust? And Finkelstein, and I quote him, Finkelstein said, "I said, Why do you have to drag in the Palestinian Holocaust? What's happening to the Palestinians is awful enough that you don't have to compare it to the Nazi Holocaust. End of quote. Finkelstein knows that this is a problematic comparison, to say the least. In 2009, Mark Levine, a historian and severe critic of Israel, published a piece in Al Jazeera on their website entitled, "Gaza is no Warsaw Ghetto." Gaza is no Warsaw Ghetto. And he enumerated all of Israel's crimes, but he also described the scale of what happened in Warsaw, and he made this warning, and I quote him: "The use of highly charged historical comparisons that do not hold up to scrutiny unnecessarily weakens the Palestinian case against the occupation. In a propaganda war in which Palestinians have always struggled to compete, handing Israel supporters the gift of inaccurate or exaggerated comparisons does not help this struggle, particularly not in Israel and the U.S., the two most important battlegrounds in this conflict." So here's Mark Levine, a Jewish supporter of the Palestinian cause, warning the Palestinians not to go down this route, and that it is a gift to the supporters of Israel to make what he calls a comparison that does not hold up to scrutiny. So if Holocaust inversion is such a gift to Israel supporters, why do people continue to give it? And in particular, people who should know better, like professors at Columbia, people who are surrounded by Israel supporters. They live in one of the world's most Jewishly saturated environments. I mean, it's one thing when Holocaust inversion is deployed in Pakistan or in Palestine, because there it makes perfect sense as a tactic. But on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, really? I'm going to propose two explanations for what might otherwise seem inexplicable. The first is that Jews are particularly susceptible to Holocaust inversion. Now, you may think that that's paradoxical. After all, how could Jews, especially in America, where Holocaust awareness is very high, be susceptible to equating Nazi extermination of the Jews with Israel's treatment of the Palestinians? The vulnerability emerges from that interpretation of the Holocaust according to which this unique event burdens the Jews with a unique responsibility. And ironically, I think probably the best summation of this was made by two Palestinians in an article they wrote, who identified this point of vulnerability when they wrote the following, and I quote them: "The Holocaust does not free the Jewish state or the Jews of accountability. On the contrary, the Nazi crime compounds their moral responsibility and exposes them to greater answerability. They are the ones who have escaped the ugliest crime in history, and now they're perpetrating reprehensible deeds against another people." So this is a fascinating idea, that the Holocaust compounds the Jews' moral responsibility. Not only were they victims of the Holocaust, but now they bear a special responsibility, a special burden on account of it. That idea was not invented by anti-Semites. It was invented by Jews, who concluded that the Holocaust, itself a unique event, obligates Jews uniquely to stand in the first line against injustice that in any way resembles the Holocaust in any of its many phases. And it's this concept, and one might go so far as to call it a conceit, because it presumes the Jews are gifted with some higher moral sensibility. It's this concept that makes some Jews especially vulnerable to the claims of Holocaust inverters, and it's why Holocaust inversion is often directed precisely at them. And it's why I instinctively classified it as Jew baiting. It's a tactic which is not directed towards the widest possible audience, but specifically towards Jews, in order to provoke a response from Jews, because to everyone else it sounds totally preposterous. Let me give two examples of the vulnerability of two fervently Zionist Jews to Holocaust inversion. The first is the case of Jacobo Timmerman, who was an Argentine Jewish dissident in the dark days of the so-called Dirty War. He went off to prison. Israeli diplomacy finally got him freed, and he came to Israel as an immigrant. And in 1982, he reported on the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. He wrote a book which was highly critical of it. I forget the title. I think it was called The Long War or something. Anyone remember? Now, needless to say, the Holocaust inverters had a field day with Ariel Sharon's march toward Beirut. And Timmerman seemed at first to see through them. Here's a passage that Timmerman wrote. Harvard is mentioned in it, which appeared in that book. The Harvard, Princeton, and Columbia professors who went along with the PLO for years, were they allies or accomplices? To speak of a Palestinian genocide or of a Palestinian Holocaust, to compare Beirut with Stalingrad or with the Warsaw Ghetto, will move no one and will only serve to feed their egos and settle accounts with other academics in whom these images can arouse guilt feelings. Jews know what genocide is, a Holocaust, a Nazi, end of quote. So that was a very straightforward repudiation of the Holocaust inverters in American academia. It's interesting that this is 1982. The same themes are returning over 30 years later. He's saying Jews know what genocide is when they see it. They know what Nazism is when they see it. And they won't be fooled and they won't be cajoled. And yet elsewhere, in the same book, Timmerman showed his own vulnerability precisely to the tactic used by Holocaust inverters when they pinpoint some supposed similarity between Israeli and Nazi conduct in order to neutralize the Holocaust as a point of Israeli reference. And here is the quote. This is about Lebanon, 1982. From now on, our tragedy will be inseparable from that of the Palestinians. Sounds like what Hamid Dabashir said earlier, right? Whenever someone says Auschwitz, people will hear Gaza. Inseparable. Our tragedy is inseparable from that of the Palestinians. Perhaps some of us will try to sidestep the Israeli moral collapse by resorting to statistics and comparing Auschwitz to Beirut. In other words, so many more died in Auschwitz than in Beirut, etc. It will be in vain, he says. The victims of Auschwitz would never have bombed Beirut. Our moral collapse cannot be diluted by statistics. End of quote. Now, this dismissive reference to statistics, right, deeply discounts one of the core characteristics of the Holocaust, which is its scale and scope. Remember that a key element, by the way, in Holocaust denial is to say that not so many Jews were killed, that the Jews exaggerated the numbers. Right? And once this is done, the door is wide open precisely to the kind of Holocaust inversion that Timmerman himself so abhors. For then any Palestinian suffering, regardless of its degree or the scale, becomes a similarity that places Israel in the dock with Nazism. I'll give you another more recent example, which I think perfectly demonstrates both the knowledge that Holocaust inversion is perverse, yet manages to leave open the door to it. It appears in Ari Shavit's new book, My Promised Land, which I'm sure many of you have read, more particularly in a chapter that is really a recycled article from 1991, in which Shavit tells of his duty as a guard at a detention center in Gaza. This is before Israel evacuated Gaza. And there he manages to conjure up an analogy between this detention camp, which was probably no worse than Guantanamo and undoubtedly better than Abu Ghraib, between this camp and a Nazi extermination camp. Let me read you the quote from Mr. Shavit. Although unjust and unfounded, the haunting analogy is pervasive. And I, who have always abhorred the analogy, who have always argued bitterly with anyone who so much as hinted at it, can no longer stop myself. The associations are too strong. Like a believer whose faith is wavering, I go over the long list of counter-arguments. All the well-known differences, most obvious. There are no crematoria here. Also, and in the Europe of the 1930s, there was no existential conflict between two peoples. Germany, with its racist doctrine, was organized evil. The Germans were in no real danger whatsoever. But then I realized that the problem is not in the similarity. No one can seriously think there is any real similarity. The problem is that there isn't enough lack of similarity. The lack of similarity is not strong enough to silence once and for all the evil echoes. It's a very curious passage. There is no real similarity, and yet there isn't enough lack of similarity. I leave you to unravel the threads in that. There isn't enough lack of similarity. This is exactly the opening that Holocaust inverters seek to enter. And that brings me to my key point. The Holocaust inverter in Western academe doesn't believe that there is an actual equivalence between Israel and the Nazis. The Holocaust inverter knows perfectly well the history and the scale of the Holocaust, knows it as well as Ari Shavit knows it. The Holocaust inverter even knows that the analogy, in some sense, is abhorrent and reprehensible. But he or she also knows that by making the analogy, the defendant, that is the supporter of Israel, will be compelled to enumerate all of the dissimilarities and in so doing leave exposed some superficial similarities that will prompt the Timmerman response or the Shavit response. That is, Auschwitz and Beirut, Auschwitz and Gaza are obviously not actual equivalents, but they belong to the same moral category. This is precisely the objective of Holocaust inversion, and Jews are the perfect target for it, because who, if not Jews, have the duty to sound the alarm when any form of injustice or cruelty has the potential to culminate in a Holocaust. In the same way, Palestinian propagandists who speak of a Palestinian Holocaust, they don't claim that the Nakba, right, 1948, approximates the Holocaust in any historical sense, but their project is to find or allege small-scale similarities, right? A massacre in Lydda, a forced labor camp at Ijlin, a hidden mass grave in Jaffa, all with the purpose of establishing the Palestinians as victims on an equal plane. The second reason Holocaust inversion persists, despite its supposedly self-defeating excess, is that it makes lesser but still preposterous analogies sound more reasonable. So Israel is not Nazi, but it is fascist. So it isn't guilty of genocide, but it commits massacres and mass killings. Gaza isn't a concentration camp or the Warsaw Ghetto, but it's the world's largest outdoor prison camp. And Israel isn't Nazi Germany, but it is apartheid South Africa. Having exhausted your outrage against the Nazi analogy, you'll be a tad less vociferous in expressing your outrage at these other analogies, which are also specious, but which now appear reasonable and worthy of debate. In other words, Holocaust inversion is a kind of rhetorical softening up. I give an example in that article about Columbia professors. I gave you a couple of examples. And then along comes the moderate Palestinian professor who says, well, actually, it was really like the fire bombings of the Germans and the Japanese in World War II. In other words, it's not the Nazis, it's just the fire bombings, which is also a totally specious claim, the indiscriminate fire bombing of Hamburg or Dresden. Suddenly seems reasonable and worthy of consideration. So I say that Holocaust inversion in these cases is rhetorical softening up. Those who use it don't seek to make the Israeli Nazi analogy credible, which is an impossible task, but to make other analogies seem debatable. In other words, it's a straw man. And that's why the urgings of people like Mark Levine, who tells Palestinians that it's a mistake to do this, are pointless. Of course, Gaza isn't Auschwitz. Levine isn't telling Holocaust inverters something they don't know. But if his argument is that it's a flawed strategy, the Holocaust inverters think otherwise, and that it works on those two planes that I indicated, and that it's worth the risks. And the counter to Levine is provided by a fellow named Jerome Slater. He's a Jewish academic critic of Israel at State University of New York, Buffalo. He wrote an interesting article just a couple of months ago. And in it he said, he acknowledges that the Nazi analogy is, as he puts it, much too strong. But it has a merit. And I quote him, "It results in a productive shock of recognition in Israel and among its friends." And he then adds, and I quote him, "Even the most severe criticism of Israel," that is the most far-fetched also, "can hardly be counterproductive in light of the fact that nothing else has proven to be productive. That's not to deny that even limited or hypothetical analogies to Nazi Germany are risky. Nonetheless, because Israel has gone so far down the road to fascism, not Nazism, the risks must be run. Desperate times require desperate measures." So even though Slater knows that and admits that the analogy is specious, he still thinks deploying it can be productive in shocking Jews, Israel and its friends, he says, and that it's a risk worth taking, a risk worth taking. I think nothing more thoroughly demonstrates the instrumental use of Holocaust inversion. Those who make it don't believe it, but they use it to bait Jews into reaction. And that reaction will usually be one of outrage, but in some small percentage of instances, it will provoke someone to hear what Ari Shavit called evil echoes. After all, desperate times admit desperate measures. This has been, of course, the rationale of dissimulation and deception since time immemorial. Well, I now come to my final question. Is it anti-Semitic? There was once something called the Working Definition of Anti-Semitism of the European Monitoring Center on Racism and Xenophobia. It was considered to be a point of reference for all those interested in definitions. I think it's no longer current, is that correct? Right. Well, basically, they no longer make a definition. And it included this statement. Examples of the ways in which anti-Semitism manifests itself with regard to the State of Israel, taking into account the overall context, could include, and in that list, drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis. Now, the key caveat here is in the overall context, right? Which I presume to mean that there must be some other less equivocal evidence of anti-Semitism in the rhetorical package in which the comparison appears. That, I would argue, is certainly the case when Holocaust inversion surfaces in the Arab and Muslim world, often in a setting which is saturated with anti-Semitic tropes about world Jewry's control of the media and the Israel lobby's grip on Washington and so forth. There it is clearly an anti-Semitic context. But Holocaust inversion is often deployed, sometimes even by Jews and Israelis, as a tactic. It's a despicable tactic because it plays on the vulnerabilities of Jews, on their unresolved ambivalence about having power in the world, on their propensity for moral self-flagellation. That doesn't make Holocaust inversion anti-Semitic ipso facto. It just makes it exploitative. And by the way, I should add that if you isolate this analogy and say this one in a certain context is anti-Semitic, and you forget to say that other analogies, such as South African analogy, the apartheid analogy, is also in certain overall contexts anti-Semitic, then it's a serious omission. And that definition did omit the other problematic analogies. But if it is a form of exploitation, then how should it be combated? I've been descriptive so far, not prescriptive. If it is true that people of basic intelligence and honesty just don't believe it, and it's usually put forward by people who don't believe it, refuting it by demonstrating that Israel isn't Nazi Germany would be unnecessary and self-abasing. And you notice I haven't wasted any time in this lecture refuting the claim itself. In these instances, the analogy is probably best ignored because the whole purpose is precisely to provoke a discussion around a point of departure, which is an absurd premise. So that would be one strategy. I do think that another prescription might be to remove Nazi analogies altogether from currency in regard to Israel. Elie Wiesel has, for example, called comparisons of Nazi Germany with Iran unacceptable. And I quote him, "Iran is a danger, but to claim that it is creating a second Auschwitz, I compare nothing to the Holocaust." Nothing to the Holocaust. If the Holocaust is indeed a unique event in human history, and if Nazi Germany is unparalleled as a nexus of absolute evil, then promiscuously invoking both of them to make some political point in the present should be rejected, I think, across the board. What are the prospects for such a rhetorical truce? Well, I leave that to you to calculate yourselves. Thank you. Absolutely, that's the point.
Good. Just remember.
You gonna call? I'll call on people.
You can just
We'll say.
repeat the question.
I'll repeat the question.
Well, you were talking about sort of the existence of this narrative in academia. But I wonder, don't you think that in order to counter this narrative, it requires that we sort of counter a sort of postmodernist stream of thought that exists in academia about genocide itself? In the sense that there are many who advance this concept of cultural genocide, or the idea that wiping out another people does not actually mean physical destruction or liquidation. It means a sort of concerted war on their existence as an entity. And that has been advanced to sort of make the Israel genocide analogy. So don't you think that we sort of have a taller order in sort of countering this inside the academy than one might think when we sort of have categories that have become decomposed or stretched?
Well, it'll be hard for me to summarize your question. Am I supposed to do it for? No bother? All right. Because you don't have a microphone, so he's trying to pick up the question. But you say it's all right.
I think it'll be all right.
It'll be all right, okay. It's a valid point. I think that the supporters of the Palestinians have much to answer for to those who are truly vulnerable to genocide in the world, and there are some even in the Middle East, for taking a term and devaluing its meaning in precisely the postmodernist way that you indicate. Because if what is happening in, say, the West Bank is genocide, then every conflict is genocidal. Sometimes on both sides. And not enough has been done, I think, obviously by those who support other peoples who are vulnerable to mass killing, to reclaim the concept of genocide. Because if genocide is everything, it's nothing. And then it's no longer possible to mobilize the international community to stop it. By the way, there are many terms that become devalued in political discourse. And arguably, the supporters of the Palestinian cause have done almost fatal damage to the concept of genocide. Now, it's one of those words which invites skepticism whenever it's invoked. It's one of those words that has become definitionally flabby. And that's unfortunate, because I think it is a term which, when it was coined, was meant to answer a very specific need. The way it's deployed now is not to answer anything that resembles the need for which it was originally coined. It's become a part of the vocabulary of defamation and delegitimation. And I don't know how it can be retrieved from that. So the more elastic it becomes, the more meaningless it has become. And that's the effect of its deployment in the Israeli-Palestinian context. Yes?
I have spent 20 or 30 years now studying genocide, writing several books about it. And there are several problems which start from the claims that the Holocaust is unique, it was the only genocide and so on. That's not so. People who say they have no idea what the definition of genocide is. And I agree with you about this use in various concepts, in various contexts, and that you might say it'd be better to abandon the whole concept, but it still has its legitimate uses, and it does have a legal definition in international law. Many of us, people studying right now, are more likely to talk about crimes against, atrocity crimes, including crimes against humanity and so on.
Why is that? Why have you abandoned genocide?
I haven't abandoned genocide.
Or why do you prefer to use these other terms? What's changed?
Well, there are many situations which are neither here nor there.
All right, so in other words, what you're saying is that although there's a definition in international law, right, that in the actual application of this definition to real life situations is problematic.
Application of legal definitions is
Always problematic.
problematic.
No, when Lemkin created this concept of genocide, he obviously meant that it would include more than the Holocaust. He himself,
Was not aware of it,
no, he was not aware of what?
of the annihilation of the Jews.
No, I think he was aware of the annihilation of Jews, but he wanted to create a category which included more than that.
Right.
And genocide was intended to do just that. But I don't think he meant for it to be infinitely elastic. Now, one of the definition that one sees in international law is I think, rather too elastic, to the point where the instances that could be categorized as genocide don't necessarily give rise to outrage, which, properly speaking, they should. And that's the consequence of an expanded definition of it. There's no getting around it. If you expand the definition of it to include a wider range of instances, then the effect of outrage, which the term was invented to provoke, will be diminished. And that's been the effect. And that's why I find it interesting that you say that, well, now we're using other terms, which are meant to evoke outrage. Right? What is the purpose of these other terms? To evoke the outrage which genocide no longer evokes because of its overuse, misuse, and abuse. And so I did not say that I think it should be discarded, but I think it has to be used responsibly by responsible people. And responsible people have to make sure that it isn't systematically abused and applied to cases which, frankly, don't rise to the level of producing that kind of an outrage. The concept of slow genocide in the West Bank is a classic example. How can that do anything but discredit the concept of
I
genocide?
don't know anybody who uses.
Ilan Pappé was the one Ilan Pappé at Exeter, who is the author of the book The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, put it forth. Tanya Reinhardt, who was a professor at my university, Tel Aviv University, a student of Noam Chomsky, used it promiscuously in all of her presentations. And it was simply a term of defamation, which was quite absurd. All you had to do was look at the numbers to see how absurd it was. So in order to create a category of genocide that fit the situation in the West Bank, you had to distort it into beyond any recognition. Lemkin would never have recognized this term, no question about it. So we have a problem. And I lay the problem at the doorstep of those supporters of the Palestinian cause who have made use of it very much in the way that the Holocaust has been used here. I don't even know that they believe it themselves. They use it simply to defame. But in the process, they wind up creating a situation where a term which once had meaning has lost its meaning. And it's too bad. Yes?
First of all, thank you very much for your interesting talk. It was really interesting to see the roots of all the things that we see today in the discourse. From my personal experience, as somebody who participates in dialogues with the Palestinians and also with the European left, I discovered that there is a narrative that connected to that. I would like to hear your maybe perspectives about it. Many Palestinians do believe that after Europeans sacrificed basically committed the Holocaust, they sacrificed the Palestinians by giving Palestine to the Jews. Jews arrived to Palestine and are doing the same thing that the Europeans did to them. Therefore, the Nakba is basically a sin that is done by the Jews after another sin was done by the Europeans to the Jews. And that basically shapes the narrative of I'll say most of the Palestinians that I met, it's widely accepted among the European left, and it causes to the same terminology that was used once in the 50s, for instance, Eichmann trial, the idea of public trials, that you today see all these Russell tribunals, self-appointed people who sit on a public square and do this judge of, I would say, crimes against humanity. It uses the same language, the same words, the same terms that were used in the 50s when we were discussed Nazi criminals. And I think it has something to do with that narrative. And of course, because today in our Western culture, all the Nazi ideas or Nazis are symbolized as the pure evil, it connects together the Jews with the pure evil, and of course contributes to the altogether to the cause.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you perfectly outlined the perspective of many Arab Muslims and also many Palestinians, among them, by the way, are some who will acknowledge that there was a Holocaust. They say, yes, indeed, there was a Holocaust. They don't deny that the Holocaust took place. But they do argue that they have been made to pay the price for Europe's sins. It is interesting, though, the contradiction between that and the notion that the Jews themselves are European colonial implants. If the Holocaust has any lesson in the context of European history, it is that the Jews ultimately were seen as the other, as not part of Europe. No more part of Europe than, say, the Muslims are now, who are subject to, say, Islamophobia. They were outsiders, right? So you cannot, on the one hand, say that this was the sin of Europe, on the other hand say, and the Jews are themselves Europeans who have been imposed on us. They were the others. They had no place there. And so much so that they were actually eradicated from the face of that continent. So where do they fit? Where do they fit? They come, they preserve this historic memory of this place, which Arab Palestinians are not prepared to acknowledge, and we see that in the whole Temple Mount issue. They preserved a language, which anyone who speaks Arabic can see as a cognate language to their own, and was a language, even if it was not spoken day to day, was the language of prayer, and was carefully preserved, and was actually used in discourse between Jewish communities, which had it was a lingua franca of the Jews across seas. So what Arab Muslims and Palestinians haven't come to terms with is this otherness of the Jew in the European context, which is at the basis of the Holocaust. And what is equally peculiar is that they do not see their own culpability in the fate of the Jews of the Arab countries in the aftermath of 1948, where basically they projected their anger at what Europe did on the Jews who had lived amongst them since time immemorial. In the case of Iraq, since even before the advent of Islam, and in some other Arab countries as well. So there are contradictions in that position. Is there any reasonable prospect of changing people's views by bringing them to light? I don't know that that's the case. In the end, Israelis won't accept the Palestinian Arab narrative, and they won't accept Israel's narrative either. They're conflicting narratives. But it has to be recognized that if there are some certain contradictions in the Israeli narrative, there are also clear contradictions in this narrative as well. Are the Jews Europeans or are they not Europeans? If they're Europe's victims and yet they're not Europeans, what is their place? If they have preserved, even in Europe, an attachment to this place, does that warrant recognition of any sort? These are difficult questions, so while you've enumerated, I think, very ably their perspective, perhaps the next time you're exposed to it, you might pose some of these questions yourself. Yeah. Yes, please.
You haven't talked about the coverage of the war in Gaza
Right.
in the media. And people who would not normally be prone to using the term genocide or analogy to the Holocaust found themselves in the midst of all the destruction sort of falling into that terminology. And I was reminded that in 1982, Tom Friedman, whom is not normally associated with the enemies of Israel, reporting from Beirut, said, the Palestinians are like the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto. They're in the wrong place at the wrong time. I thought to myself, how can you think that? But there he was with bombs falling and so on. And so there's a kind of destabilization or distortion that takes place in the heat of the moment that I think puts in the record the kind of language that you've been talking about. And once it's there, you can't get rid of it.
But the important point to recognize, and I'm going to look now for this Tom Friedman's reference in his reportage. I don't know if it was in his book also. Is it in the book as well? Beirut to Jerusalem? I'll look for it. What's interesting is that this recognition of you've basically done what Thomas did there was a Shavit maneuver. In other words, he sees a similarity. He knows there's no similarity, but then there's no comparison to be made, and yet there's some flash of similarity that he sees. Now, the very same events can take place in Iraq or in Syria. American commander in Afghanistan will not suddenly say to himself, my goodness, this is like the Warsaw Ghetto, or this is like Auschwitz. Here I am in Guantanamo or in Abu Ghraib, and I'm duplicating an extermination camp. Why is that? In fact, if you had someone get up and say, in this country, that what the United States has done in Iraq or in Afghanistan was to pursue a Nazi agenda, and that the American forces there were acting like the Waffen-SS, you would say, lunatic fringe, right? Lunatic fringe. You'd find that on some crackpot website. And the reason
I think on the far left you did get us.
on the very, very edges, no responsible journalist would even speculate along those lines. Right?
That's why I brought up Tom Friedman,
Right.
who would be considered a moderate.
Which is why I say that's why I come back to the point I made before. Jews are the ones who are susceptible to Holocaust inversion. That's why it's used. That's why I call it Jew baiting. No one else is susceptible to it. Jews are. And that's why it's deployed, even by people who don't believe it. Even by people who don't believe it. Because Jews have this flash of recognition. The evil echoes, as Ari Shavi said. It's up here. It's up here in the minds of Jews with their historical experience. It's not out there in reality.
Do you think that if Tom Friedman were confronted with this emotional outburst today, what would he say? If you said to him, look, that's what you said, Ben, do you still believe that? I wonder, he probably would say that I was at the moment, that's what it looked like.
I would like to think so. But look, Ari Shavi took something that he wrote in 1991. He recycled it in this book in 2014.
That's what I'm saying.
He didn't change it. He could have. He could have said, looking back in retrospect, and all that's happened since, I gave examples, everything from Guantanamo to Abu Ghraib. Maybe I shouldn't have been making this comparison, even in my head. But he doesn't. He doesn't. He lets it stand as it was. So I don't know what Tom Friedman would do. But that's.
I think he probably feels he wished he'd not said it.
He wished he'd not said it. I don't know if he was criticized at the time for saying it. But it just comes back to my point that the people who, the reason that Holocaust inversion flourishes in the academy and in the West is not because the wider public responds to it. It's because Jews respond to it. Jews suddenly see some flash of recognition. Jews feel some moral capability. Jews see the slippery slope. If we do this, the next thing you know, the settlers who are like Hitler Youth, the next thing you know, we're Germany maybe not 1942, but we're Germany 1933 or 1934. You get this all the time.
I think there's a wider audience, though, with moral sort of susceptibility than just Jews. People on the
yes,
left in general
right.
feel strongly about
right. But not on but what you find on the left generally is not this response to the Holocaust inversion. It's the South Africa analogy. That's something which I didn't discuss here, but it's something that has the broader appeal. The Holocaust inversion is directed towards the Jews. The South Africa analogy is directed towards the wider audience. And that, I think, that's the key distinction. I don't think that most people who are not Jews respond to the Holocaust analogy except to say, the Holocaust inversion is absurd or far-fetched, but forget about that. There's the one that's credible. That's credible. Only the Jews begin to ponder and think of the implications of the Holocaust analogy and be tormented by seeming parallels. Yes? Go ahead.
That was an excellent talk. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
I had 2 comments, and I'd like your reaction. One is overriding the issue you're talking about specifically is the political use of language. And George Orwell wrote this classic essay, I think in 1949, called Politics and the English Language. And the use of terms like genocide, apartheid, war on women, it's used really to stifle thought. And there are these little phrases, these cliches that people keep using, and they've been using that since, Orwell's time. And I think it really bespeaks a historical illiteracy, that people don't know that much of that history, and this is what they, go back to, Nazi Germany. I think it's interesting that Stalin's Russia is never used as a historical analogy. It's just like it never existed. So I'd like comments on that. And the other thing is, and you're a historian, the only case I know of where there was an attempted genocide in the Middle East is when Saddam Hussein had the Anfal campaign, where he was determined to kill every Kurd in Iraq. And could you comment on that, about whether that is the case, whether there was anything similar to that in the history of the modern Middle East?
Well, excellent point. Let me take your first point one step further. You talked about language. I think that we have to be particularly aware of the role that analogies play more generally in approaching issues in the Middle East. Analogies are substitutes for analysis. They aren't tantamount to analysis. Analogy is something you use when you have a blank, when you draw a blank about something, you see some similarity to something that you're familiar with, and you project the familiar upon the unfamiliar. All right? In that respect, it differs from comparison in the social sciences. In comparison, you know the 2 instances you're comparing to an equal level of depth. And then you draw comparisons between. Analogy, you know one, you don't know the other, and you project one upon the other. And the rampant use of analogies in the Middle East, and one could write a book on this, going back from Anthony Eden calling Nasser a Hitler, to George Bush, the father, calling Saddam Hussein a Hitler, to analogies that are used by the Palestinians, where the Israelis are crusaders, and so forth and so on. All of these analogies, and by the way, making that claim knowing nothing about the Israelis, or next to nothing about the Israelis, all of these are substitutes for in-depth understanding and analysis, for knowing the history, right, and knowing the context. So we're in a sad case where much of, and by the way, Muslims can come along and say too that they resent the concept of Islamofascism, which is another kind of analogy which is drawn. There's the widespread proliferation of analogies in regard to the Middle East is just a sign of a general ignorance. And the irony is, especially for, say, the younger generation, when this South African analogy is deployed vis-a-vis Israel, is they don't understand that either. I mean, how many people in your generation really know the story of South Africa? Probably very few. So it's not just a case of something you know being projected on something you don't know. It's something that you have an ill-defined notion of being projected on something that you have no notion of, which is even worse. The latest fad, by the way, is the idea that what Israel is like is settler colonial America vis-a-vis its indigenous population, right, the Native Americans. Settler colonialism. Why is this analogy suddenly popular? Because there is an acknowledgement here of the grievous sins which were done towards the indigenous population. Let's take that and project it into another context altogether. Then you get these comparative settler colonial studies, which throw all these things together in one bag. It's all a polemical exercise, and it's a substitute for serious analysis. So personally, I think that that in an ideal world, people would know the issues and would know the history and wouldn't use the crutch of a convenient and often self-serving analogy. But what can you do? I mean, analogies pervade politics. Policymakers use them, by the way, often to fill in gaps of knowledge. And so suddenly this becomes a Munich, and that becomes, the usual litany. And then analogies are used within. People look at Iraq through the lens of Vietnam, et cetera, et cetera. Highly problematic. And I'm just giving you basically one example of a pathology which is really quite widespread. In the back row, please.
I have two questions. One, I've seen on the internet Max Blumenthal and other anti-Israelites making the ISIS analogy or ISO, and I was wondering who do you think the audience for that is? I cannot figure it out for the life of me. Secondly, how did the Shin Bet become such an institution with an agenda? And more broadly, it seems the Israeli intelligence community, thinking Unit 8200 this summer with the intelligence leaks. Is it just a holdover from the labor era, or
Holdover from?
the labor era?
Uh-huh.
Or what is it? It's in the U.S. you would not have political activism in the intelligence committee.
Right. Well, interesting question. Regarding your first one, this Max Blumenthal comparing the Islamic State to the Jewish state, right? And this is a variation of it. Well, I think I said earlier when I talked about the 1940s, how what happens is that you have this projection. I said the approach of anti-Zionists was always to associate Zionism with the most threatening and ominous evil of the day. This is exactly a case in point. The most threatening and ominous evil of the day is the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant. And so you have a projection. That's all it is. And what is the presumed similarity? A religious state. Jewish, Islamic. This is the presumed similarity. As if this alone, this mere fact that one is, that Israel calls itself a Jewish state and the Islamic State calls itself an Islamic State, creates total congruence of, I don't even want to begin to try to refute it, to go on and say this is liberal democracy versus totalitarian theocracy, so forth, the caliph and so forth. Why even go there? It's just a form of defamation. It's defamation by analogy.
You think they don't believe it either? You think the people who say it don't even believe it?
Look, if it were true, then Max Blumenthal wouldn't show up in Israel because he knows his head would be on a platter. Okay, and his head is not going to go on a platter when he goes to Israel. Quite the contrary. Go around with his film and make his YouTubes and whatever it is, and so forth and so on. By the way, the reason he also uses a provocative Holocaust inversion in his chapter headings. One is called concentration camp. Another refers to Kristallnacht in some way or something. And so there's this, I don't know whether Max Blumenthal is an anti-Semite or not. It's not to the point, but he also uses analogy as defamation. And this is not the end of it. The next time there's some new ominous evil of the day, then Israel will be compared to that too, I can assure you. Charles. And what, you had another?
The Shin Bet question?
The Shin Bet question. There's, first of all, don't ever take 2 or 3 representatives of any organization as being evidence for this kind of thing. In Israeli politics, it's very often the case that people have epiphanies. Whether it's Rabin suddenly becoming a man of peace. This also happened to General Harkabi, who wrote the Arab Attitudes to Israel, which has a lot on these issues, and then had his epiphany. Or Benny Morris, who went the other direction. And you have examples cutting both ways. It is true that in this country, it's uncommon for former intelligence officials to come forward, although that's changed too. I mean, you have Robert Gates writing his memoirs. It's becoming more common here too. Believe me, you'll be in this country where we are in Israel at some point too, where people in their afterlife as in the political realm will use their intelligence credentials to bolster their political views. I know a lot of people in the intelligence business. There are a lot of different views there. They usually have these awakenings only after they're out of office, and sometimes out of a motive to act in a contrarian way and so to remain relevant in the political arena. And I could name some other instances too. I don't think it has to do with labor per se. But it will be interesting to see what happens in future, because many of the people in intelligence today are not labor, but come from have other political affiliations, although they aren't manifest in their day-to-day work. The Gatekeepers was an interesting film. I think he recorded something like several hundred hours. I'd like to know what wound up on the cutting room floor that left us with the hour and a half that we had. I suspect that the director of the film had a particular agenda, and it was an easy job with that much footage to do the clipping to get what you wanted. And I think you could have taken another group of interesting officials. There is, by the way, another film which was never appeared in English translation, of former heads of the Mossad, done in a similar way, which was shown on Israeli television. And there you get almost the other side of the story. They take political views which are opposite those that were taken by the heads of the Shin Bet. So, I say be wary of what you hear from top ex-officials. It's not always, when you're in Israel, you know that if you have a political position that needs bolstering, go and find a general, and you'll always find one.
The gentleman was also asking about Unit 8200.
What about 8200?
They came from these intelligence leagues and the
Right. That's Unit 8200 is a huge unit. Look, it's like these BDS petitions. Now, BDS petition was signed by 60 members of the Princeton faculty. Not BDS exactly, though. Let me correct myself. They have called on Princeton to divest from companies which profit from Israel's occupation of the West Bank. That's 60 professors. How many didn't sign? How many received that petition in their inbox and ignored it, or discarded it, or sent it to spam? It is telling when you have enough people coming together to make a statement, but doesn't mean that it represents the considered opinion of everybody who is a veteran, say, of a unit like 8200. And I know that there were many members of 8200 who were embarrassed by it. They didn't feel that it would be appropriate to take the same measure of coming out in public to refute it, but they made certain journalists aware of their opposition to it, and so it was taken with a grain of salt. You don't hear much discussed, and it was just a matter of a few months ago. Charles.
So I want to ask a question. So first of all, thank you very much for the great presentation. You said in the presentation that a lot of the sort of anti-Semitic propaganda came together in the academy. And I agree with you. And I was thinking that in a sense, the inversion and sort of labeling Israel as sort of the incarnation of Nazism and carrying out the Holocaust, that sort of thing, or Israel and Auschwitz, Gaza and Auschwitz. In a sense, it's a very extreme analogy, and yet it's had an impact. People like Friedman and Shavit and Amos Oz, people fall into it. So even though it's an extraordinarily extreme issue or phenomenon, it's had an impact in an important way, as you point out. And yet, my question is, I'm not articulating myself very clearly, but I'll try. So this is a very extreme case in a sense. Yeah. Contemporary anti-Semitism, I would argue, is predominantly now, in the contemporary context, an attack on notions of Jewish peoplehood.
Mhm.
So I was wondering, in the academic environment, where people are not using this extreme case, but use sort of postmodern literature, and so we were talking about Edward Said and kind of the material that comes out of his intellectual standards and leadership. There's disciples in Israel and all over the world. We were speaking earlier, I was speaking earlier with Hannah and David about the environment at Harvard and other universities where Jewish professors, Alan Dershowitz spoke about this in New York last night at an ISGAP event, how many Jewish professors find it increasingly difficult to stand up against this onslaught against Jewish peoplehood in Israel.
Mhm.
And it's more mainstream and perhaps more nefarious than this extreme case. Can you comment on that?
Mhm. Well, the Jewish peoplehood issue is an important one. It's another one. And you know the argument that it was academized by Shlomo Zand, who was a colleague of mine, former colleague of mine at Tel Aviv University, in his book, The Invention of the Jewish People. The concept of the Jewish people was a 19th century invention by historians, very convenient for Zionist purposes. He also wrote a subsequent book called The Invention of the Land of Israel. That, too, he said was a 19th century invention. And in a way, it is a continuation of that old theory, which Arthur Koestler was associated with, that, in fact, those who call themselves Jews are actually descendants of converts in Central Asia, the so-called Khazars, and so this was the cruder form of this denial of Jewish peoplehood. They imagined themselves to have both their language, their history, and so forth and so on was all a creation of imagination. There's a lot of interesting research in all kinds of directions that counters this. There's some interesting research, which I'm not competent to judge, on which relies now on genetics, which is, as I understand it, the thrust of which is to establish that, in fact, there are very real connections between the Jews and the populations, which are still indigenous to the Middle East. Peoplehood is a matter of history and consciousness, though, more than it is a matter of direct descent. And those who deny Jewish peoplehood still have to somehow explain the miracle by which it has been preserved through the many vicissitudes of history. Arnold Toynbee, by the way, was one of, who I mentioned earlier, was one of the most noteworthy theoreticians along these lines. He wrote claiming that the Jews were a kind of a fossil people. I don't know if you're probably too young to have read it, but go back and look up Arnold Toynbee, Jews and Fossils, and you'll see the famous debate. He was then confronted by this by
With Abba Eban?
Abba Eban, and then
McGill.
at McGill.
Hello.
Yes. No, it wasn't Abba Eban, it was Herzog.
Oh, you're right.
Yaakov Herzog confronted him. They had a very famous debate over this. The fact is that, anti-Semites have a difficulty explaining the persistence of this awareness among a group of people that they are a people, in circumstances in which other human groups have disappeared from the historical record. So it is convenient for them to argue that this is simply a recent or late invention.
But I was also more referring to in Europe and North America, the attack on Jewish people is really focused on the connection of Jewish people to the land of Israel.
Right, well, that's-
the Jewish state.
Right.
And this is creating an atmosphere, I think especially in the academy, which is becoming increasingly difficult for Jewish scholars to show allegiance to Israel or
Yeah.
to even their own
Yeah.
cultural heritage.
No, you're right. There's another aspect of this, by the way, which is, and you often hear the claim made that, of course, to be anti-Zionist is not to be anti-Semitic, which is obviously in some cases true. But I would say that it's becoming more and more difficult to maintain that position over time for a very simple reason. When the State of Israel was created, I'll give you an example of American Jew. There are 10 American Jews for every Israeli Jew. Now it's about 1 to 1. The day is approaching, and the next generation will see it, where the majority of the world's Jews will be Israelis. And when we get there, it will be more and more difficult to say, yes, I am anti-Zionist, anti-Israel, and I favor the elimination of Israel as a nation state for the Jewish people, but I'm not anti-Semitic. Because Israel will not only be the home of the majority of Jews, but it will be the place where normative Judaism comes to be defined. That's a very different situation than in 1948, and certainly a very different situation than in 1918. So I think that argument is going to be increasingly difficult to maintain. It'll be interesting to see what further contortions take place in order to uphold it. Yes, Yan.
I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about the direction of Europe. The numbers of Arabs in France and Germany have skyrocketed, and also in United Kingdom, and specifically from your experience as the president of the university, academic boycotts, I guess, just also BDS in general. What do you think relations between Israel and the EU will look like in the coming years and decades?
Well, I'm no expert on Europe, and I'm not there much except on occasional vacation. I don't get invited to conferences in Europe. There was a time when I did, in the mid-1990s, when the peace process was in bloom. Europeans had this notion that they would create all sorts of fora which would bring Israelis and Arabs together, and so then I was all over the map. But that ended, and that's that. Europe is less interested in facilitating that today and in coming to accommodation with its growing Muslim population. And the day could come when, as it is, looking, say, at the last 100 years of Jewish history, Europe was the center of Jewish life. Now it's a place we just mostly fly over on the way back and forth to Israel. And I think there is a legitimate concern in Israel that Europe could somehow become detached from this collective idea of the West under the impact of absorbing large numbers of non-Western immigrants. But then others say that this is an exaggerated concern. Certainly for Israel, it means that in the longer term, some of the sympathy that Israel enjoyed in Europe is disappearing, and Israel's relations with parts of Europe will be more strained. On the other hand, there are other areas of Europe which have come back into the limelight, in Eastern Europe, for example, where you don't have large Muslim populations, which are very eager to have relations with Israel, and in discovering their Jewish legacies. So who knows? It's difficult to make predictions about Europe. I'll say one thing about BDS, and this applies as much to the United States as to Europe, maybe even more so. It is a fact that that every time a BDS resolution is passed, you hear all the many voices opposing it. University presidents and provosts issue statements. You had this with the American Studies Association. One of the salutary effects of that is that it got all kinds of higher administrators to issue statements saying, of course, we reject the boycott. But there's a stealth boycott that's taking place. And we already feel it in Israel. You organize a conference. In the past, you issued invitations to the conference. 50% of the people replied that they were coming. Suddenly you issue invitations for a comparable conference, and you see that only 15% of the people say they're coming. And no one says, I'm boycotting Israel. No one says, I'm not coming because of your crimes in Gaza. They have other commitments, clashes with some other activity. They can't tear themselves away. But the numbers are the numbers. You're doing a comparable exercise. In the past, you got this result. Now you're getting a different result. And what you understand is that de facto, there is a stealth boycott underway. No one admits to it. No one confesses to it, but it's taking place. And we already see the first signs of that. So I'm not reassured when presidents of universities and provosts issue these statements. I'm not even reassured necessarily when organizations reject BDS resolutions. The effect of this agitprop is that a boycott is taking place, a stealth boycott. And I think it needs to be closely monitored, and it needs to be discussed. We don't have time here to go into ways in which to deal with this, but basically what it means is that if anybody has any sense that an academic boycott is unfair, immoral, or illegal, now is the time for them to show up in Israel. Have you asked a question yet?
No.
No, you haven't. Okay, I'll get to you again. Go ahead.
In view of everything that's happening in the world vis-a-vis Israel, do you see any fulfillment of biblical prophecies for end times?
No.
Okay.
This gentleman, by the way, came traveled an hour to get here, so I thank you in particular for showing up. Yes.
I'll just pose this question to sort of follow up on the academic discussion. I mean, sure, people who shouldn't necessarily make these analogies do make them, such as Thomas Friedman. But we also have rather eminent personalities who are experts in European history, who are experts in fascism, who are very much disturbed by a sort of rising tide of chauvinism among some on the right in Israel. I can think of Zev Sternhauer, for example. I mean, history is not destiny. The future is not destiny. There's nothing to say that a neo-fascist element could not animate some thought on the right in that country. And I think that you would say that some street leagues like La Hava, for example, do conjure some of those memories. So my question to you is, obviously we need to push back on, most analogies made in this vein are false. But is there a room to have that discussion about whether some sort of rise of chauvinism might suggest something disturbing in Israeli politics that we want to counter?
Well, let me pose the question this way. Moshe Zimmerman at the Hebrew University once made a statement where he said that the settlers, the more extreme settlers, were like their young people were like Hitler Youth. Okay. Does that advance our understanding in any way of the phenomenon itself? Or is that just meant to shock us? Does that actually add credibility to Moshe Zimmerman in the claim? Or does it actually create a sense among most Israelis that, these people are alarmist, this is the way they frame it, let's dismiss not just the analogy, but the underlying phenomenon which could give rise to concern. So, I don't, now, why would someone like Zimmerman or Sternhal? Because they're Europeanists, and supposedly they know, the European context. So they're bringing their knowledge to bear to say, we see these similarities. But, I mean, someone could come along and say, I'm an expert on Afghanistan, and they look like the Taliban to me, right? Or Blumenthal saying it's the Islamic State. I mean, the number of analogies you can draw when you're dealing with, say, West Bank chauvinists or settler chauvinists is unlimited. But do any of them enlighten us in any way about the phenomenon itself? Or is it polemical point scoring? It seems to me that the choice between Hitler Youth, Taliban, or Islamic State is a very rich menu that doesn't really add much taste to the eating. So I would adhere to my position that these analogies don't get us anywhere. They are a substitute for analysis of the phenomenon. They are headline grabbing, and the effect of them often is to conceal the realities of the situation. And I would argue, too, that if you look back at sort of the way in which analogies were used in other Middle Eastern contexts, whether it was Suez in '56 or whether it was the Iraq War, some of the reasons that you didn't see what was actually going on in Iraq was because you were using a certain analogical framework. Saddam Hussein is Hitler. Which then you would have assumed that the Iraqi people was somehow amenable to a transformation such as took place at the end of the Second World War in Germany. That didn't happen because the analogy misled. Noah Feldman, who teaches there, said that when he went off to Iraq, it's in his book about Iraq, he was on a transport plane. Everybody was sitting there reading. They weren't reading books about Iraq. They were reading about the post-war transformation of Germany and Japan. That's the books that they brought with them to read on the transport plane. It turned out that none of that would have been nearly as useful as a few good books on Iraq. So, obviously, if you've had a tremendous success, as in the reconstruction of Europe in the aftermath of the Second World War, you say, well, I want to build on that. And I want to derive the lessons from that. But you can't make an analogy to a situation which is totally different. And that was part of the failings of what happened in Iraq in post-war things. So I think it's the same here. If you want to deal with the whole question of radicalization in Israel, it has to be done in its own terms. These analogies are not going to tell you how to deal with it,
You're
how to quell it.
skeptical of comparative politics, it seems.
I am. I'm a historian. I'm not a comparator. But remember, I made a distinction between analogy and comparison. People who do good work in comparison know in depth what they are comparing. And in the course of the comparison, not only do they see the similarities, but they see the differences. And the whole play of analysis, right, is to use the comparison to highlight the similarities and the differences. People who use analogies have one blank and one thing they think is filled in. And all they see are the similarities. The analogy that they're pushing to you is based on the similarities, and the differences are concealed or downplayed or set aside. That was the case in Iraq. That's the case in Holocaust inversion. That's the case in the South Africa analogy. So yeah, I'm skeptical. I can appreciate good comparative work when I see it. And there are a few examples in the Israeli-Palestinian case of political scientists who've done that. The vast amount of polemical analogy making that I see doesn't qualify as social science, and I think it's fundamentally misleading.
So on that note, thank you very much, Gordon.
Thank you.